57 years ago, two men rode on horseback along a creek bed in Northern California and came back with 59 seconds of film that scientists, forensic experts, and skeptics still haven't managed to fully agree on. Not because nobody's looked closely at it, because almost everyone has, again and again, with every tool available at the time, and the film has somehow managed to survive every single attempt to definitively close the case. Physical anthropologists have measured its subject's stride. Hollywood costume designers have tried to figure out whether 1960s technology could have built what's on screen. A tenured professor has spent decades studying the skin ridges on the footprints left behind. And still, no verdict. This isn't a story about some new AI program cracking an old mystery overnight. It's a much stranger, much more interesting story about just how hard this particular 59 seconds of footage has been to explain, one real expert, one real analysis, one real decade at a time. On October 20th, 1967, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were riding through Bluff Creek, a remote area of Del Norte County near the creek. Patterson grabbed his 16mm camera and shot what would become 59.5 seconds of footage, showing the figure, later nicknamed Patty, walking away from the camera before glancing back once over its shoulder. The two men had actually been in the area searching for exactly this kind of evidence, following up on earlier reported sightings and tracks in the region, which is part of why skeptics have long questioned the timing of the encounter, while believers point out that plenty of genuine wildlife sightings happen to people who are actively out looking for them in the first place, rather than to random passers-by with no particular interest in the subject. Patterson died of cancer in 1972, still maintaining the film was genuine right until the very end, reportedly turning down opportunities to profit from admitting a hoax, even as his health declined and money grew tight. Gimlin, now in his 90s, has spent nearly 6 decades giving interviews about that day and has never once changed his account of what happened, including in interviews given well into his 80s and 90s, long after any financial incentive to keep the story going had mostly dried up, and long after he could have quietly walked away from the whole subject without much consequence to his own life. What makes this particular piece of footage different from essentially every other piece of cryptid evidence ever recorded isn't the story behind it, it's what happened after. Almost immediately, serious researchers with real academic credentials started treating the film as something worth actually testing, rather than simply dismissing it outright or accepting it at face value. An unusual response for a piece of amateur footage shot by two ranch hands with no scientific training of their own. That's the part of this story that rarely gets told, because the honest, decades-long scientific back and forth is a lot messier and honestly a lot more interesting than any single dramatic headline could capture, whether that headline is promising definitive proof of Bigfoot or a final, conclusive debunking. The first major academic to take a serious, sustained look was Dr. Grover Krantz, a physical anthropologist at Washington State University who spent much of his career studying primate anatomy before turning his attention to this specific film. Krantz spent years analyzing the footage frame by frame, focusing specifically on the figure's stride, its center of gravity, and its overall biomechanics, treating the project with the same rigor he would have applied to any other anatomical specimen. He calculated the creature's shoulder width at roughly 8.2 inches. After accounting for an inch of hair, which he estimated at over 35% of its standing height, a proportion he argued fell well outside normal human range, even for someone wearing padding underneath a costume. Krantz also focused heavily on the figure's gait, describing a walk where the body leans forward and the knees stay noticeably bent, with both feet remaining on the ground for an unusually long portion of each stride, a pattern he demonstrated himself on camera for a Discovery Channel documentary, leaning forward and lifting his feet high as though wading through deep mud to illustrate exactly what he meant. In Krantz's assessment, that specific gait, convincingly, for the full length of the film, would have been extremely difficult for a person in a costume to fake, without breaking form at some point during the sequence. Krantz became further convinced of Bigfoot's general plausibility years later, after examining a set of unusual footprints found in Bossburg, Washington, nicknamed Cripplefoot, which showed what appeared to be a deformed foot complete with consistent, anatomically plausible healing patterns, detail he considered unlikely for someone to have faked convincingly using 1960s prosthetic technology, and casts of which he later donated to the University of California, Berkeley's anthropology collection. Krantz wasn't working in a vacuum, though, and not everyone with equivalent credentials agreed with his conclusions. John Napier, a primatologist at the Smithsonian Institution, who had previously built a respected academic career studying primate locomotion and hand anatomy, published his own detailed assessment of the film in 1973, in a book called Bigfoot, The Yeti and Sasquatch in Myth and Reality. Napier raised a specific concern that Krantz's analysis didn't fully resolve, pointing out an apparent mismatch between the figure's estimated body proportions and the footprints attributed to it at the scene, an inconsistency he felt didn't fit cleanly with a single, coherent living creature, since the relationship between a creature's overall size and its footprint dimensions tends to follow fairly predictable patterns across known primate species. Napier also raised questions about the frame rate Patterson's camera had actually been running at during filming, since the exact speed affects how researchers calculate the figure's walking speed and stride length, and Patterson's own account of the camera settings shifted somewhat in different retellings over the years, a small but persistent inconsistency that later researchers would continue arguing about for decades without ever fully resolving it to everyone's satisfaction. Napier remained genuinely uncertain rather than dismissive, acknowledging the film contained details that were hard to explain away entirely, while stopping well short of endorsing it as proof of an unknown species, a carefully hedged position that frustrated both firm believers and firm skeptics in roughly equal measure. If you're the kind of person who finds a decades-long, genuinely unresolved scientific debate more interesting than a tidy answer wrapped up in a single dramatic headline, go ahead and drop a like on this one. It genuinely helps this channel reach more curious people who feel the same way. The gate argument that Krantz considered his strongest piece of evidence eventually came under direct challenge from a completely different angle. David Degling, an anthropologist at the University of Florida who has written extensively on human and primate skeletal biomechanics, argued that the so-called compliant gait, the bent knee walking style Krantz considered nearly impossible to fake, could actually be reproduced by an ordinary human being deliberately walking that way. Degling's position was straightforward. The specific combination of stride length, posture, and walking speed that Krantz found so compelling wasn't necessarily unique to some unknown creature. It was, in his assessment, a walking style a person could consciously imitate, particularly someone tall wearing a costume designed to obscure their true proportions, which meant Krantz's supposedly airtight biomechanical argument had a real, credible counter-explanation sitting right alongside it. Not proof of a hoax, but at minimum proof that the walk alone couldn't settle the question either way. Degling laid out this argument in detail in his own book on the subject, Bigfoot Exposed, walking through the specific mechanics of how a costumed human could plausibly reproduce the movement pattern Krantz had spent years treating as definitive. A different kind of expert entered the picture through the footprints rather than the film itself. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, has spent decades studying plaster casts of alleged Bigfoot footprints, including some connected to the Patterson-Gimlin encounter, building what has become one of the largest academic collections of purported Sasquatch track casts anywhere in the country. Meldrum has focused heavily on dermal ridges, the fine skin texture patterns similar to fingerprints that appear in some of these casts. His argument is that replicating this level of microscopic anatomical detail in a fake footprint, using the tools available in 1967, would have required a level of forethought and technical skill that seems disproportionate to the effort of just faking a costume, since whoever created the print would have needed to understand and reproduce skin ridge biology that wasn't even well documented or widely understood at the time outside of specialized forensic and medical circles. Meldrum has written extensively on the subject, including in his book, Sasquatch: Legend Meets Science, which lays out his methodology and findings for a general audience while still grounding the work in his formal academic training. He remains one of the few tenured academics still actively researching the topic, using mainstream scientific methodology, publishing his findings and defending them at academic conferences, even though the broader field of anthropology has largely declined to engage with the subject at all, treating it as a fringe pursuit unworthy of serious departmental attention, regardless of Meldrum's own academic standing. The film itself got its most detailed forensic treatment from someone outside traditional academia entirely. Bill Munns, a Hollywood special effects and makeup artist with decades of professional costume design experience, building creature suits for major film and television productions, conducted an extraordinarily thorough frame-by-frame analysis of the footage, published in his book When Roger Met Patty. Munns approached the question from a completely practical angle, essentially asking whether the special effects technology available in 1967 could have realistically produced a costume this convincing, drawing directly on his own hands, on experience with the materials, techniques, and limitations that existed in the film industry during that specific era, well before the animatronics and advanced prosthetics that later productions would rely on. His conclusion, based on his professional experience actually building costumes and creature suits for a living, was that reproducing the fluid muscle movement, the specific proportions, and the overall realism visible in the footage would have been a genuinely difficult technical challenge for the film industry of that era, requiring resources and expertise that, to his knowledge, simply weren't available to a small independent film crew operating on Patterson's modest budget. He stopped short of declaring the footage definitively authentic, framing his findings instead as a serious challenge to the simple hoax explanation rather than confirmation of anything supernatural, a distinction he was careful to maintain throughout his published analysis. The most direct hoax claim came from an entirely different direction years later. In a 2004 book called The Making of Bigfoot, The Inside Story, journalist Greg Long presented an account from a man named Bob Hieronymus, a Yakima, Washington resident who claimed he had worn a gorilla-style costume for Patterson during the filming, describing the experience of walking through the creek bed in character and even demonstrating what he called his own version of the distinctive walk for cameras decades later. According to Hieronymus' account, the suit had been custom-made by Philip Morris, a real well-known costume designer whose work is documented elsewhere in the entertainment industry, and whose skill at building convincing gorilla suits for Hollywood productions was well established, independent of any connection to this specific case. It's a specific named claim from a specific person describing a specific costume maker, which on the surface sounds like exactly the kind of clean resolution this story has always lacked. The kind of named on the record confession that skeptics of far less documented cryptid claims usually wish they had. Except it hasn't actually settled anything, and being honest about why matters here. No physical suit connected to Hieronymus' account has ever been produced or independently verified, despite decades having passed since he first came forward with his claim. Other people who knew Hieronymus at the time have offered conflicting accounts of his whereabouts on the day the film was shot, some placing him elsewhere entirely, working a different job at the time the encounter reportedly took place, which directly contradicts his own claim to have been the person inside the suit. Philip Morris himself gave inconsistent statements over the years about exactly what, if anything, he sold to Patterson, and precisely when that transaction supposedly took place, details that shifted somewhat depending on which interview or which decade you're looking at, further complicating any attempt to build a fully airtight timeline out of his side of the story alone. Hieronymus' story has never been corroborated by physical evidence, and it exists essentially as one man's account, made decades after the fact, sitting alongside Krantz's biomechanical arguments, Meldrum's dermal ridge analysis, and Munz's professional costume assessment, none of which it has managed to definitively overturn, despite being, on paper, exactly the kind of direct confession that should have ended the debate outright. If this kind of honest, unresolved scientific mystery is exactly the kind of story you come here for, go ahead and subscribe. Because there's a lot more of this coming. The kind of story where the real answer is messier and honestly more interesting than a clean, satisfying verdict handed to you in the final 30 seconds of a video. It's worth being completely clear about where mainstream science actually stands on all of this, because that context tends to get lost in the back and forth between individual researchers. The overwhelming majority of professional anthropologists and primatologists have never accepted the Patterson-Gimlin film, or any other piece of Bigfoot evidence, as credible proof of an undiscovered large primate living in North America. No bones, no verified remains, no scientifically confirmed DNA sample, and no body has ever been produced in over half a century of searching, despite Bigfoot being one of the most searched for cryptids in American history, with organized expeditions, dedicated research organizations, and even reality television budgets thrown at the problem over the decades, without producing a single piece of physical evidence that has survived rigorous laboratory scrutiny. Multiple hair and tissue samples submitted over the years as potential Bigfoot evidence have been tested using modern genetic sequencing, including a widely cited 2014 study led by geneticist Brian Sykes at Oxford University that examined dozens of hair samples submitted by cryptid researchers from around the world. And in every rigorously documented case, those samples have been identified as belonging to known animals, ranging from bears to dogs to, in a few cases, humans, rather than anything unexplained or genetically novel. Grover Krantz and Jeff Meldrum represent genuine exceptions within the field, credentialed scientists willing to seriously study this material using their actual academic training and formal research methods. But they remain a small minority within their own disciplines, and their conclusions have not been broadly adopted or replicated by the wider scientific community and peer-reviewed literature, a distinction that matters enormously when separating individual expert opinion from anything resembling genuine, consensus-driven scientific acceptance. That doesn't mean the film itself is uninteresting, or that the decades of forensic attention it has received were wasted effort. What makes the Patterson-Gimlin film genuinely unusual, compared to almost every other piece of cryptid evidence ever recorded, is that it has survived nearly 6 decades of sustained, serious scrutiny from people with real, relevant expertise. Gait analysts, forensic costume specialists, physical anthropologists, and forensic photographers, without any single one of them producing a conclusive, universally accepted explanation in either direction. Compare that to the sheer number of other famous cryptid photographs and films that have circulated over the same period. the Loch Ness surgeon's photograph, various supposed Yeti tracks, and countless other alleged sightings, most of which were convincingly debunked within months or a few years of surfacing, when someone with the right expertise finally took a close look at the actual physical evidence involved. Most alleged evidence for cryptids gets debunked relatively quickly once anyone with real technical expertise takes a close look. This particular 59 seconds of film is unusual specifically because that hasn't fully happened. Even after this much sustained expert attention from multiple independent directions across multiple generations of researchers, each arriving with their own specialized tools and their own reasons for skepticism. The film has also been repeatedly reprocessed using whatever technology happened to be available at the time, well before anyone thought to attach the word AI to any of it. Researchers have stabilized the shaky handheld footage, adjusted contrast and exposure to bring out additional detail, and digitally enhanced individual frames, particularly the famous frame 352, which shows the clearest view of the figure's face, hand posture, as it turns to look back at the camera. Video enhancement specialists like M.K. Davis spent years running the original footage through successive generations of digital processing software, each new version claiming to reveal slightly more facial and muscular detail than the last. Work that has been shared and reshared across documentary productions, cable television specials, and online communities for decades. Each new claimed enhancement generating its own fresh round of debate about what exactly the added detail was actually revealing. Each new pass has extracted marginally more visual information from the original film, without producing a result that decisively settles the debate one way or the other. That pattern itself is worth paying attention to. 60 years of steadily improving technology applied to the same 59 seconds of footage keeps sharpening the picture without ever fully resolving the underlying question, which says something honest about the actual limits of image analysis applied to a single, short, blurry piece of 1960s film, regardless of how sophisticated the enhancement tools eventually become. Whether that enhancement comes from a film lab technician working by hand or the latest generation of automated software. So where does that actually leave things today? The scientific consensus remains firmly skeptical of Bigfoot's existence as an actual species, and nothing about the Patterson-Gimlin film changes that broader picture on its own, no matter how many individual details within it have proven stubbornly resistant to a simple, tidy explanation. At the same time, the specific claims made by serious researchers on both sides of the debate, Kranz's biomechanical analysis, Degling's gait rebuttal, Meldrum's dermal ridge research, Munz's costume feasibility assessment, and Hieronymus's unverified confession all remain exactly where they have been for years, genuinely contested, individually incomplete, and collectively unable to close the case either way. Anyone claiming otherwise today, whether that's a documentary promising a final answer or a viral video claiming some new piece of software finally cracked it once and for all, is almost certainly overselling what the actual underlying research supports. That's not a satisfying answer if you're looking for a dramatic reveal. It is, however, the actual, honest state of 57 years of real research into one of the most thoroughly examined 60 seconds of film in American history, still standing, unresolved, precisely because it turned out to be far harder to definitively explain than almost anyone expected back in 1967, when two men on horseback first came home with a story nobody, including them, could have predicted would still be debated generations later.